It's not just about clicking record, it's about clicking publish. It's not if you build it, they will come, that field of dreams line. It's not about just building it. You have to go and promote it. Go on social, share it, get it into your newsletter, maybe even run ads to it, but get it out in front of people first for them to find it. Make sure that they are very aware that you published a podcast. That's how you're really going to get ROI from it.
You're on a mission and you just need more people to know about it. And whether you're brand new to marketing or a seasoned pro, we are all looking for answers to make marketing decisions with purpose. I'm Monica Pitts, a techie, crafty business owner, mom, and aerial dancer who solves communication challenges through technology. This podcast is all about digging in and going digital. I'll share my marketing know-how and business experience from almost 20 years of misadventures. I'll be your backup dancer so you can stop doubting and get moving towards marketing with purpose. Hello again, and welcome back to Marketing with Purpose. We are coming to you today with a guest, and we're going to interview him about podcasting because he's a podcasting expert. And I know that we've had a couple episodes on podcasting before, but they're just coming from me hanging out over here behind the microphone. I don't do it for other people. I just do it for myself. But Khalil, our guest today with Benali, he actually has a new business that helps people start up their podcasts and actually helps run them for them. So Khalil, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your company to kick us off.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here. We had you on our podcast, The Cashflow Contractor, just a couple of weeks ago, and it was actually a great episode. We've heard a lot of good feedback from it. So thanks for having me on, and thanks for being a part of our show.
No problem.
Yeah. Demandcast. We're talking about podcasts. I've been a part of, I think I've been on over 300 episodes of podcasts, variety of podcasts at this point. And I think it's one of the best mediums to be able to create content. If you understand content and the value of it, that it lives on, that it grows without you, then podcast really falls into that in such an easy format. I think not many people are great writers, but most people can speak, especially if you're a small business owner, maybe the president of an association. You are talking for a living most times. You're having to lead people, go into conversations. And so rather than limit your audience to whoever's in front of you at a given time, what if you can open that audience up to whoever wants to listen whenever they want to listen? That's kind of the idea of a podcast. And so excited to talk more about that today.
I love that you say that podcasting goes on for a long time. Like, we've been running our podcast since 2019. And last year, I just looked over the data and we had like a 27% growth in listens and downloads. And I went back to all those spikes because I'm a complete geek. And I was like, what episodes did it? And what was crazy is it wasn't just one episode, friends. It was like this day, somehow lots of people found us. And it was like one listen on like a gajillion episodes, right? Mm-hmm. So I always say it's more like a marathon, not a sprint. So tell people kind of like, when they're thinking about getting into podcasting, what does that look like for them? Is it going to be like, whoo, bang, all kinds of attention? Or is it more of like a slower roll?
Definitely a slower roll. I think the most important thing to understand about a podcast is that you are not going to be the next Joe Rogan. You are not going to be the next favorite podcast that you listen to. Most small businesses, associations, anybody that's starting a podcast, unless you're doing it for entertainment purposes, you're not going to go viral. And you shouldn't be trying to go viral. You should be looking at one target audience. Who are you trying to speak to? And what's a valuable conversation that matters to them that we can have on our show? What's a question they have? What's a problem they have? What's an obstacle they're running up against? Let's talk about those things, because that's a valuable conversation to our target audience. And our target audience may be really small, and that's okay. Maybe we only get 50 listens a month. That's fine if it's the right 50 people. So that's the first thing that you have to get your head out of thinking, man, I want 10,000 downloads per episode. That's a very hard feat to get. And I'm not saying you can't get there, but you're not going to hit it day one unless you're an entertainment-based podcast, because that's what tends to go viral. So really, we're talking about conversations that matter for your target audience. So in order to get started, there's a lot of barriers that people think in their mind that really aren't. At the end of the day, I would focus on the quality of content above everything, more than the quality of the way your video looks, way more than the quality of your audio. Focus on the quality of your content. That's the most important thing. That's what keeps people listening. With your quality of video, audio, whatever you're doing, it does matter. You don't need to be in a wind tunnel recording audio. No one wants to listen to that. But you don't have to spend $500 on a microphone. You can very easily even record just with good quality headphones. For your video, most webcams are fine, but you may upgrade your webcam a little bit to make sure you have a better quality. And if you want to go into high-end production, then find someone who understands that. Also, another misconception that people have is that you have to be in person. And right now, Monica and I are not in the same place. We are miles and miles apart. And that's kind of the standard right now for a lot of podcasts, especially niche podcasts that are very industry specific. When you're remote, there's great tools. There's so many out there. Popular ones, we use Squadcast personally, but you also have Zencaster and Riverside, as well as a number of plugins that go directly into Zoom that work fantastically. So it's not an issue. You can find a really good tool, probably even free, but as little as like $15 a month to be able to do that. So that's kind of the setup process. More so it's about just getting reps in. I'd say the more challenge is on that quality side of the content, of feeling comfortable having these conversations on a recorded format. And it's not that hard, but you just need to get a couple reps under your belt.
Yeah, definitely. Because everybody's going to start where they are. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame in you using your, headphones, what do they call them? I'm pulling a blank now. My little iPhone headphones. I've had a number of guests that use that for their audio and they sound great. Even back in the day, they had, like you just said, they had them plugged into their ears and they were plugged into the phone, and it was great. Sure. So one thing you mentioned was problem solving, and you said, can I solve a problem for my audience through my podcast? And I think that one problem that our listeners face, because we do have a lot of construction companies that are bigger, we have a lot of nonprofits as well, is just communicating with their constituents. Not so much always an outward facing podcast, like something that you're trying to get more business with or get more donations with, though some of our nonprofits are definitely trying to do that with their podcasts, but also just educating the people that you already know. Can you talk a little bit about how someone might use a podcast to solve the problem of maybe internally communicating within their company to help improve culture, or, connecting with their donors regularly to make sure that they know what's going on?
Absolutely. So we've worked with several different types of companies that are running podcasts, and I'll go through a couple of examples. One of them is for it's the EDPA. It's through the president of the EDPA, which is the Experiential Designers and Producers Association, which is really for trade shows. Chris Griffin's the president of the EDPA, and he has his own podcast, and it's a great opportunity for him to not only promote his company through the podcast and what they do, but really to promote the EDPA and show the value of it. And so he regularly has members of the EDPA on the podcast to not only talk about what they do, but to talk about the value of the EDPA. So it becomes a really great marketing resource for their association. The other thing is the legislative side. They were huge trade show. You can imagine the trade show industry was really affected by COVID. And nobody was going to trade shows. And so it was huge for them to get some legislative action in place so that they could get help with, not laying off everybody and getting more financing to help through the pandemic, around a number of other issues as well. But for the EDPA, they covered a ton of the legislative topics on the podcast in detail with experts that were out there lobbying every single day in DC. And they were able to get all of the really important information about the legislative acts into an audio and video format that was much more digestible than reading PDFs and all sorts of information about the legislative actions. And then they were able to get them even into clips. So they're just talking, there's probably 12 items they're talking about inside of it. Well, maybe only one of those items mattered to the target audience. And so they were able to get a clip of each of the 12 items so that if I'm wanting to learn more about it, I don't have to listen for an hour and a half about the legislative action. I can just listen to the 10-minute clip of that one part that was really pertinent to me. And then that can be promoted out on social media or sent in a newsletter, et cetera, et cetera. They're still running today. Experience Builders is their podcast, and they're doing a great job. But that's one way they've used it on the legislative side. We also have someone that does a quarterly, they have several different types of episodes, but one type of their episode is a quarterly update. And it's really, they have several subcontractors that are a part of their company, more or less. Their subcontractors only work for this company because they have so much work for them. And so they've really got a lot of people that listen that are really just internal for the most part. And on their podcast, they do a quarterly update where they talk about some of the biggest things they've accomplished in the last quarter. They even recognize some of their subcontractors or their employees in those podcasts. But then they also talk about where things are going, what's coming up in the next quarter, what they're looking forward to, what they're watching out for, challenges that they may face, new processes that they have to implement. And they talk about those things as a way to lift up their industry and show, hey, we're being the example here, but also as a way to update all their subcontractors through a really easy medium. They don't have to call an all hands meeting every quarter and hope that people show up. It's a recorded format that can be clipped out where there's very specific, topics that are covered, and I can listen to 5 minutes and get the topic, or I can listen to the whole thing. So those are a couple of different ways of using the medium of podcast to get out to people that are more internal, either inside your association or inside your company.
I like the idea of using it almost like a newsletter. I think, I don't know. Well, I'm an audio learner, so that's how I intake information. And it's funny because I have a 9-year-old who is the exact same way, and she never shuts up, like ever. And as she's doing even her math homework, she has to say every number out loud. And I'm like, oh my gosh. She's like, Mom, the numbers don't even make sense until I say them out loud. And I'm like, yeah, that's way to be audio, girlfriend. Way to be audio. Can you go in the other room for a second and be audio in there? Right?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned it's kind of like a newsletter. I kind of want to back up and just talk about content because, maybe there's contractors out there that aren't doing content. We work with a lot of construction companies and they fail to do content oftentimes, but even associations and other small businesses may be struggling to get content out, meaning they're not really good at putting their newsletter out consistently, or they don't even have a newsletter. They don't have any articles on their website. They're not really educating people through content. They're just doing it through one-to-one conversations. They have to schedule a meeting to get information across. And the challenge with content is that usually there's maybe like a president of an association, for example, who has really the knowledge to be able to educate people, to update people with content, but they're limited. They're just one person. They can't write a newsletter and an article and go to the meeting and do all these things on top of their already busy schedule. What's great about having a video podcast is that you are basically multiplying yourself. If you can do a video podcast of yourself and then take that, you don't have to take it. Let's say you're the president of association, you do the podcast. That's it. You spent an hour recording it, step away. Somebody on the team now can use the exact words, the exact knowledge of that president to put the podcast out on YouTube and on Spotify and on Apple, but then make clips of it. So now that we have these 5-minute clips that can go out on our YouTube channel, as well as our Facebook, our LinkedIn, our Instagram. And then also they can take the transcript from that podcast and somebody can then listen to it and make it into a newsletter that's written format. They can make it into an article that goes on the website. They can make it into an ebook guide that we send to people as a PDF that is kind of the standard for training people on how to think about this topic, right? And so just by doing that 1-hour podcast recording, not only do you have a podcast now, but you've now created a content strategy for your team, for your company to be able to get content in all the different mediums on all the different channels for your target audience. And so that's one really big reason why I love it, is because you can get the expert to multiply themselves really easily.
You can use it for training too, internally.
Absolutely.
We actually just had a conversation the other day. We're trying to really nail down how we want to talk about the 3 different ways that we build websites. And Stacy talks about it every day. I talk about it less often. And I was like, Stacey, I need to get better. Like, we need to like go back to the like note cards. We're going to trade shows here in a couple of weeks. I need to get this down so I'm good at talking about this. I'm not afraid to say I suck at something. and
Yeah.
and she was like, you know what, I'm just going to record myself talking about it, and then we can listen to it and we can digest it and make it into something that is, you know, easy for you to use. And two, like when we have ran, like there's a local year-end giving campaign called Como Gives, and we for the longest time did all the training for the nonprofits to get them ready to go for their year-end giving campaign. Like, here's all the stuff you need to get done. Here's how you need to think about it. And we offered it both in video training and in audio training. And the audio training was just a podcast. It's literally just a podcast. I just uploaded it into our podcast hosting space, and you can just play every single episode. But then they had the opportunity to learn it however best fit their schedules, right? I love that. I love that they can the president can multiply themselves. It can power their content strategy, but also you can use it in other ways too in your business to help it, you know, solidify and come together. So that brings me to another thought though. All right. So you're like, this president is just going to sit down and do like this 1 hour podcast, and you make it sound like it's going to be so fast.
Sure.
So what type of time investment are people looking at when they decide to, like, let's say one episode? What type of time investment are they looking at with that?
Depends on what level you're at. If you've hired a service to kind of help you do the editing, do a lot of the post-production, you can really limit it to, you know, per episode, anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on how much strategy you want to put into it. If there's a guest involved, how much, you know, how long the episode is. You can really get it down to 1 or 3 hours per episode of your actual required time. If you're going to be doing all of the editing, all the post-production, it can take as much as 25 to 30 hours per episode, depending on what exactly you're doing. Are you mixing and mastering? Are you getting really high quality audio of 4 guests on one call with transitions between speakers, and then getting for each, you know, for an hour episode, then turning that into 10 different clips that are 5 minutes long, as well as, you know, snippets that are for TikTok, where you're getting maybe 20 of those, where you're getting really good quotable moments. And then are you also going to have advertising spots that are mixed inside of that video, where there's got to be even more thought put into the editing and the timing of the ads and all that stuff. So it just depends on how big you want to blow it up. But there's one person I've seen that does it he records his episodes are 40 minutes because he uses the 40-minute limit on Zoom for his recording because he doesn't pay for Zoom. And while you're on it, he does his ad reads, his intro, his outro, and he literally just takes no editing, grabs it, publishes it. And so it's 40 minutes per episode for him. I mean, maybe an hour, 20 minutes to download it and publish it. But that's all he does. And he's got a successful show. He's got a software company that caters to construction companies, and he does really well. So you can do it like that, but you just have to understand who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. That was his goal. That's what he does. I think more realistically though, if you are going to hire a podcast service company, 1 to 3 hours per episode.
Well, then this guy that you were just talking about, who can, you know, do it on his own, it sounds like he might be a solo
he is
human. He's not inviting guests on.
I think he has an admin. That's it. No, so he does have guests. I've been a guest on his show. Guests? Yeah. So he schedules it. So there's a little bit more, if we're talking about the administrative side of the podcast and scheduling and all that stuff, it's really what you make it. This guy's really good at sales. He's always networking. And so for him, he can just say, hey, would love to have you on my show. And maybe he sends out 20 of those a week, and maybe he gets 3 replies back, yes, you know, but he's recording at least twice a week.
The response rate for people being on your show is actually really high. Like for me, I feel like I don't have a lot of problems with like having people turn me down to be on my show. Now, if I want to be on someone else's show, that takes a little bit more work, but tell me a few tips about guests, because I think a lot of people have the intention of having guests on their podcast, and they, guests are sometimes like, it's like having people over to your house. Sometimes they're amazing, and sometimes they leave and there's half drank sodas all over the house. And you're like, how did this even
Sure.
happen? And where did the sodas even come from?
Yeah. You definitely, I always encourage people to start out with people that they love talking to. Maybe it's a really good client. Maybe it's someone internal on your team that's really great at, they're always giving presentations or lunch and learns at different companies. Salespeople are great talkers usually, and have those cues of like, I'm talking too much, or I'm not talking to enough, or I didn't really make a point there, right? So you want to make sure that your first few guests are someone you're comfortable with. I also don't recommend you going and finding your all-star guests that, dream guests and having them be your first or second interview, because it's challenging to interview someone without any practice. So unless you're really good at doing interviews that are recorded, get some reps underneath your belt first. But for the most part, here's how I think about guests. It all starts with your audience. Make sure that you know your audience and think about who they want to be on. Think if it makes sense for them. And then what is the value that they're really going to bring? What are the things that they're going to talk about that are going to make my guest go, ooh, that's interesting, right? With that being said, your audience typically likes to see, one of three kinds of people that have been there, done that, so that are already in their shoes. So, let's say I am a small business owner that owns a framing company. Maybe you bring on the largest framer in the Southwest, who's grown to, over 200 million in revenue or something like that. Wow, if I'm a framer, I want to hear this guy talk, right? Or a girl talk. So been there, done that. The next one is really that expert advisor role. So maybe they haven't been there, done that, but they've, let's say maybe you're still that framer, and this is a subcontractor attorney who's worked with over 500 subcontractors on their contracts and litigation. Man, I have zero idea about legal, and I should probably know a little bit, because I feel like I could get, really hurt in the future because of this. That's probably a good one because it's specific to me, but it's also a really good advisor. The last one is someone who hasn't been there yet, but is on the journey. That's really helpful as well. So maybe you're an association and someone just became a member. We did a podcast edit once for someone who had just become a part of a teachers union in Massachusetts. And the reason they joined was because they got into an issue at their local school, and it was with a parent and a student. They were not in the wrong, but they didn't have any legal cover, and they decided to join the union, and the union ended up representing them in court. And so they basically told that story of, man, I didn't know what I was doing. Now I'm a member of this, and now I got access to the litigation, but I also had resources, and it actually helped me in my lesson planning as a teacher. And there were so many benefits that they were seeing live. Maybe it's the construction company that's just getting started out, and they're basically getting a consult live on the podcast from an expert from your company, right? Those are the three types of episodes that do really well. There's other types of episodes you can do where maybe it's a customer testimonial where you're talking about their experience working with you. But those are some really good formats that can be helpful for your content strategy. I will say one thing that we haven't talked about is podcast as a sales tool. A lot of contractors, especially on the commercial side, it's very hard to build relationships with the key decision makers. And so maybe your podcast is about, you're a construction company and you work with commercial GCs, and you're trying to get more opportunities to bid, and you want to build relationships with GCs. Maybe your podcast is about general contractors and how they achieve success or something along those lines. Go and target those general contractors, ask them to be on your show, and let that be a way of opening up a door for you to now have a relationship with that GC, right? So those are some examples of episode types you can have, and also how to use it as a sales tool.
I love it. I especially love the journey example, because especially if your product or service is a personal transformation for people, a lot of the times people, they want to get all the way to the other side, but that feels like insurmountable. And so if you can show them people along the way, along the steps and the phases of the journey, then you can build hope for them and benchmarks that are realistic, and they can really see themselves in those people's shoes. So it's a pretty powerful thing, because a lot of people are like, I
Yeah.
want to start a business. I want to start a podcast. Right. That's
Yeah.
why they're listening today, because they're thinking I might want to start a podcast, but they're talking to two people who've released, hundreds of episodes. So that's
Yeah.
different than if you listened to our episodes, episode number 20. Like, go
Yeah.
back and listen to that one.
Yeah.
Because, everybody starts where they are. And yeah,
Absolutely.
so
You're going
I
to get
love
better
that
over time.
example. Okay, so my last topic that I kind of wanted to cover today was ROI, because I this is tricky because it's not a sprint, right? You already said that. It's more like a marathon. It's like a slow roll. So I feel like some of the people that start their podcasts are going to get, hundreds of downloads, and other people, maybe 20 is awesome. Like,
Yeah.
so tell us about how you can gauge your return on investment, and maybe even like when it's okay to walk away. Like, what, start with
Yeah.
gauging, and then I'll ask you when you walk away. How does that sound?
There we go. Well, I think for the most part, like I said, you're not going to go viral with your niche industry specific podcast. It's most likely not going to happen. There's not a lot of those out there that are viral. In terms of, gauging your success, it's not like Google ads where you have a pay-per-click and you know exactly how many impressions you're going to get and you can calculate that. It's not to that level. You're going to be able to get some analytics in terms of listens and maybe shares, depending on which channel you're monitoring the analytics on, when they drop out of the podcast, those kinds of things. But the real value isn't in how many listens you get. I always tell people to measure their success in podcasting by how many times people bring it up to them, right? You are the president of the association. How many members have said, oh, I love that episode with so-and-so, right? And you can see some of that on like social media, for example. You can see if people are commenting on it or sharing links to it or reposting. That can kind of be a good gauge for you as well, to show like, oh, wow, people thought that this conversation mattered and they're finding value in it. But if people are finding value in it, you're going to end up winning long term. Let me just give you an example. There's this, if you're interested in gauging ROI of not just podcasts, but even social media, you need to understand dark social. I believe Chris Walker is really the guy that came up with this idea of dark social. But the reality is that you go into your HubSpot CRM or your Salesforce CRM or whatever account-based marketing software you might be using, and a majority of your leads or opportunities, meetings booked, whatever your metric is, are going to be coming from Google search or paid Google. And there's a reason for that, because if you think about your buyer's journey, how you buy products, how you try to look into software, how you try to look into a podcasting service, whatever it is, maybe you saw a post on Instagram. There was a little clip on there that you watched and you said, oh, that's really cool. And then 2 weeks later, you saw another one from the same person. Oh, wow, that's really cool. Maybe I should search that. And so then you go and you open up Safari on your iPhone or Chrome on your Android, and then you search it. Oh, what was the name of that? Okay, let me search it. And then it gets attributed to Google. But the reality is that Google was not the original source of you finding that tool, service, product, whatever it is. It's just that you end up going to Google to make your decision-based actions. Oh, I now want to check that out and actually buy it. So now I go and I search it. It's either organic Google or there is an ad for it. So you click on that. And now your CRM is attributing that to Google. The reality is it's based upon that podcast that you did or that social post that you put out. So don't think that you're going to have really clear-cut analytics. Think about how many times people are mentioning it, what the engagement's like in terms of comments, shares, likes. And then if you'll have a just kind of a gut feeling though of like, oh, wow, someone brought up the podcast again. Someone brought up the podcast again. And then it's going to grow. The other thing I will say about the value of a podcast is that it's not just about clicking record. It's about clicking publish. And what I mean by that is it's not if you build it, they will come, that Field of Dreams line. Like people think about that with content in general, and it's not about just building it. You have to go and promote it. And for a podcast, it's not just enough to get it up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube. That's not enough. You have to go and promote it. Go on social, share it, get it into your newsletter, maybe even run ads to it, but get it out in front of people first for them to find it. Make sure that they are very aware that you published a podcast, and it's not just that, oh, you put it inside of Apple Podcasts and it's there to live. You've got to go and promote it. That's how you're really going to get ROI from it. And that's how I would measure it.
Yeah, I like the example too that you do have to promote it, because when I look at our own podcast analytics, I see that most of our listeners, like 90 something percent, listen on Chrome. And it's because the way they find out that we have an episode is that I email them and then I take them to my website. I have links to the multiple networks that it's on, but they click on the link, they go to the website, and they just press play there, right? So they're listening to it out on Chrome, not in like iTunes, which kind of sucks, because I'd like it to happen out there too, but I'll take what I can get. And I do like what you said too about the feedback, because I definitely, that's one of the way I gauge if an episode was good or not. If a really good episode, somebody's going to email me back about it.
Absolutely.
And if like 3 people email me back, that's doing pretty darn good. I know it's like a really low percentage, but it took time out of their day and they did it. So
yeah, don't go for viral. If you're having the right kinds of conversations, hearing from 1 or 2 people is more than enough, right? And that's the other thing I was going to say in terms of your analytics that you mentioned earlier, is that you may, see huge spikes, but it's not because of a certain episode. They're listening to 10 episodes, and that's going to happen. And the reality of podcasts is you'll get people to binge, just like you get onto Netflix and you watch that show and then you finish it in 2 days. They're going to end up binging your content that matters to them. And the way that they're finding your podcast could be from a podcast search, but most likely it's because you promoted it. And so I would venture to say that whenever you're looking at your analytics and you're seeing a spike in your listens, don't actually look at what episode was there. Go and look at your social calendar and your email newsletter and see which newsletter did we put out, which social post did we make, because that's likely the source of the spike in traffic.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because one of my email list subscribers just emailed me and was like, oh my gosh, I just listened to like a whole bunch of your episodes because I was cleaning my house for, deep cleaning. And I just wanted to like follow up with you and ask you about that work travel trip you guys did in Costa Rica. Like, are you going to do it again? And I'm like, thanks for emailing. That's awesome. It makes you feel good when people respond. So friends, if you are listening to something and you really like it, go ahead and email that creator, because there's nothing that will make their day faster than getting feedback about something that they've made. Yeah. Okay. So I told you that I was going to ask you when to walk away, because I think that's a tricky thing about any marketing venture is you start in on it. You have to do it for a while. It's not just you don't see immediate results. You got to do it for a little while, and you have to allow yourself to grow. You're starting where you are, but then when does it make sense to say, maybe we don't do this anymore? Yeah.
No, great question. I think for me personally, there's a variety of reasons you can have a necessary ending in life and in podcasts. Necessary Endings is a great book by Dr. Henry Cloud. Highly recommend it, especially if you're in business, because there's things that you have to say no to. A lot of times we can feel like a quitter, and that's against our philosophy and it goes against our character. But the reality is that there's seasons in life where we end things. Just like we can't grow tomatoes in Alaska in December. That's a natural thing, right? You have natural times in your life when you're supposed to be in school and when you're supposed to be executing. There's times when you're supposed to be, really investing in your life and your personal side, and times when you're investing in your career. So what's a necessary ending for a podcast? I think the most natural necessary ending is when your target audience has either changed or they're not finding value. That's the biggest one across the board. So, man, we set out to start this podcast so that we could grow our target audience of association members. Well, are they actually finding value in it? Is anybody from that audience bringing it up to us? Is that still our target audience? Maybe we're focused on specific types of members and now we're not really on that type of member and we need to kind of shift directions, okay, that's a necessary ending or a pivot to the next part. Maybe the person that was really running the podcast for the most part, and not something that you can outsource, like the editing of the podcast, but like literally the thought leader on the podcast is leaving, it might make sense to end that podcast if you don't have somebody who can replace it, right? I've had both of those situations happen. Actually, it's with the same exact podcast where their target audience changed. They were going after residential cabinet manufacturers, and their target audience changed to go to more direct to home buyer or homeowner, right? And so they changed from cabinet shop to homeowner. The podcast didn't make sense anymore. They were talking about things that cabinet manufacturers cared about, and now they're trying to talk about things that homeowners care about. Just didn't make sense, so they ended, right? I've had it where the host, one of the hosts of the podcast, was heading out, time to retire. Well, do we have someone who can fill their shoes? Not really. Okay, let's just end the podcast. So those are the times that make the most sense for me. If you're not hearing feedback from your target audience and it's not supporting other content you're doing, sometimes you may think, well, no one's listening to the podcast, but all of our blogs, all of our articles, all of our newsletters stem from the podcast. You should still be doing the podcast if people are engaging with those other medium formats. If they're not, okay, we got to rethink our content strategy altogether. So I hope that's a good enough answer, but it really evolves around your target audience. Are they finding value? Are they still your target audience? And is it actually working? That's what I'd bow out if those things aren't true.
I think that makes perfect sense because we started like our podcast as just marketing with purpose. And then we segmented it into having two podcasts. We had construction marketing with purpose and nonprofit marketing with purpose. And for a while, we covered a whole bunch of really specific topics. And then we just ended up having our topics, they kept diverging, like it kept just overlapping. And I was just publishing the same stuff in each of the podcasts. And then I was like, why am I doing this? Like, this doesn't make sense. And so since everything just seemed like it was really overlapping, we just brought it back in and took out the words in front of the title of the podcast so that it was just marketing with purpose. And it turned out okay. Like it wasn't a bad thing. People were fine with it. And the reason that it worked okay to serve both audiences out of the same podcast is because they share the same core values. And a lot of the times they share the same struggles. It's kind of like when we've done like really strong nonprofit initiatives, I've just emailed, I struggled with it. I was like, oh, I'm not going to email out my entire email list. That's silly. And then I was like, no, construction companies have the same core values, a lot of them as a nonprofit. They're just running as a business, right? And so they're all about the customer, about serving them, about making sure that they take care of the families of the people that they employ and doing a great job and, producing incredible results for people. And nonprofits are doing the same thing. So I email out the list and I got my construction companies emailing me back. And they were like, this is such an incredible initiative that you're doing right now. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm on the board of this nonprofit. I want to send it over to the president. And I was like, yeah, okay, see? And so it kind of works in the way that they overlap like that. But I was really surprised at the feedback on it. It was pretty cool. Okay, so before we close, now I know that the tech thing is really challenging for people, and you provide a tech solution for people in their podcast, but it's more than a tech solution. It's like a whole organization solution. You're like your product is DemandCast, but ultimately it feels to me like you're almost a department of their company that is helping them produce this podcast. Can you just really quickly tell us about it in case people are like, yeah, this sounds great and everything, Monica and Khalil, but like, a tech bad. No.
Yeah. No, totally get it. So a lot of, we wanted people to be able to have conversations that matter, right? And that takes a variety of shapes, but really, if you're going to have conversations that matter through a podcast, you've got to make sure that you're set up properly, and then that you're organized and you're able to promote. So that's really what we set out to accomplish. With DemandCast, we work on one-time at podcast episodes if you want, or we do, monthly recurring episodes that we work on, as well as fully managed podcasts. So I'm going to start with the fully managed podcast really quickly. We'll help you get everything set up so that you can run your own show. And then from there, we'll make it to where all you need to do is show up for a little bit of strategy and the actual recording. After that, you review any of the work that we've done to make sure that it's up to par with what you want. We find a cadence pretty quickly to where you're comfortable with that. So that's kind of the fully managed side. And then from there, there's people that are really already running a show, maybe like yourself, Monica, that really have all this in place. They've done the editing for a while, or they've used another company, but they don't feel organized. They feel like they're just getting things last minute. They feel like they don't have the tools they need to be able to promote their show really easily. That's where we come in and we help them. They literally just upload a file for us. There's a little bit of setup at the beginning so that we know what your music is, what your thumbnail is, any graphics that you want. And then from there, we do all of the editing. We do all of the post-production where we get that 60-minute episode into bite-sized chunks that can then be promoted in a newsletter or on social media accounts. And we get it in a really clean delivery deck that's sent over as a PDF with every episode that goes live, so that all you have to do is look at the PDF, say, I want to post that clip, click download, and upload it to your social media. So that's really what we do at DemandCast. We make it simple to have a podcast. And we've been doing it for, a year and a half now. Got several clients on board on both sides of it. Just the kind of one time they'll send us over whenever they have a really big guest, they send it over to us. So they have a really nice delivery deck. When their guest, the episode goes live, they send it over to the guest. Hey, please promote the show. And it's really easy for that guest to promote it. And then we have some that we're doing the fully managed aspect, where every week we're doing a recording for that show. So that's us.
The delivery deck part is really important. Actually, from my podcast guests, the most compliments I get are that after the podcast goes live, they get an email and it has a graphic and it's easy to share and links to social. And they're like, it just made it so easy. And I'm like, well, yeah I set it up in Airtable. So it automatically sends, because I kept forgetting to do it. It just, things get busy. Well, Khalil, if people have questions about your service or about, podcasting in general, how do they get a hold of you?
Absolutely. Demandcast.co is our website. And then also you can reach out to me through benali.com or my email, Khalil, Khalil at Benali, BENALI.com.
Thank you so much. Okay. And tell them one more time the name of your podcast. And if you guys really want to hang out with Khalil and I again, you can go over to his podcast and I'll tell you about websites.
Yes, absolutely.
Super big surprise there, right?
The Cash Flow Contractor. I'm co-host with Martin Holland. If you're a construction company, definitely give us a listen. We talk about all things in growing and building your construction empire. So it's a lot of fun. We're almost up to episode 200, goes live next month. So yeah.
Congratulations. Well, thank you everybody for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this episode or if you learned a thing or two, then feel free to subscribe. Or also you can head over to mayecreate.com. That's MAYECREATE.com and get the show notes. I'll have links to Khalil's contact information so that way you can really easily reach out to him. And you can subscribe to our email newsletter where you can get an email about the episodes every single week, because like Khalil said, it's not just about hitting record, it's about hitting publish. And so that's how we'll keep you informed. So thank you so much. And until next time, everybody, go forth and market with purpose.